Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are looking at a political threat that was, well, it was supposed to be a checkmate, a game ender.
Right.
But instead, it just fundamentally and permanently rewrote the rules of North American commerce. We're deep diving into the weaponization of food trade.
Specifically, agricultural tariffs.
Exactly, the ones that were intended to bring Canada to its knees.
That's right. And if we set the clock back, we're talking about the moment the U.S. administration under Donald Trump announced these huge reciprocal tariffs on agriculture. Something like 250%.
And the thinking was pretty simple, right?
Yeah, very straightforward. Canada relies heavily on the U.S. for its exports. So the idea was if you threaten their biggest market, you can force them to the negotiating table.
Okay, let's unpack that because this is where the story gets really interesting for anyone tracking global trade. This is the twist. The U.S. plan didn't just fail. I mean, it detonated on contact.
Yeah.
Instead of crippling Canada, it kicked off this full-scale permanent restructuring of the entire North American food trade.
It did. Canada just executed this strategy to find new buyers all over the globe. And not over 5 years, but I mean, it felt like it happened overnight.
Leaving American farmers just watching their second largest export market just walk away.
It's a masterclass in miscalculation. The U.S. administration thought it was demonstrating strength, but it actually exposed this dangerous fragility in its own agricultural sector.
So our mission today is to give you a shortcut to understanding this catastrophic cell phone.
A very good way to put it.
We're going to dig into the trade misunderstanding that started it all, what we're calling the dairy lie. Then we'll detail Canada's pretty aggressive $12 billion diversification strategy.
And then we'll get into the vulnerabilities that these actions exposed in the U.S. agricultural system itself.
Okay, so let's start with the big one. The issue that fueled all the political fire, dairy.
Dairy.
The claim, and we heard it over and over, was that Canada was charging these astronomical 250% tariffs on American dairy, that this was crippling U.S. farmers. This was the justification.
And what's so crucial here is to separate the rhetoric from the reality on the ground. Those 250% tariffs, yes, they exist.
They are real.
They're real, but they only apply if U.S. exports go over a pre-negotiated quota. They're a penalty for over-exporting.
So they're like guardrails. They're not the default entry fee.
Exactly.
So the big question is, were American dairy producers even close to hitting those quotas?
Not even remotely. I mean, in so many categories, including just liquid milk, the U.S. wasn't even using half of the volume it was allowed to export with zero tariffs.
Right, not even half.
Not even close.
Yeah.
In fact, the U.S. dairy industry's own lobbying group, the International Dairy Foods Association, they put out the data. They calculated the average fill rate for all U.S. dairy products was only 26.72% at the time.
Hold on. So you're telling me the political outrage was over a 250% tariff, while American farmers still had access to more than 73% of their potential export volume at zero tariff?
That's it. That's the core of it. The potential was just sitting there, completely unused.
That's astonishing.
It is. It shows the whole conflict wasn't really based on an economic reality. It was a political maneuver. As one expert on this stuff pointed out, in practice, these tariffs are not actually paid by anyone.
So the narrative about crippled American farmers it falls apart. It was a politically useful story.
And that action, using food as a weapon, that was the trigger. The U.S. failed to realize that when you threaten a country's food supply, you force them to find permanent, more reliable alternatives.
And Canada saw the danger right away.
Immediately. I mean, their agricultural system had this one huge vulnerability. 75% of all their food and beverage exports went to the United States.
That is a massive dependency.
It's a huge geopolitical liability when your biggest customer suddenly becomes unpredictable.
So their response wasn't to back down.
Yeah.
It was to pivot hard.
Very hard. Farm Credit Canada put out this major analysis that outlined a radical plan to systematically shift $12 billion of food exports away from the U.S. market.
And this wasn't just some desperate reaction, was it?
No, not at all. It was a highly sophisticated structural plan, and they executed it with incredible speed. It had three main parts. First, a domestic shift.
Okay.
They aimed to boost trade between their own provinces to replace about $2.6 billion in U.S. imports with Canadian products.
Right. Control your own supply chain first. Makes sense. What was the second part?
The second was finally using their existing trade leverage. Canada already had 15 free trade agreements with 51 countries.
Wow. 51.
Yeah, but they were still mostly just selling to the U.S. These threats gave them the political will to actually make those other agreements work for them.
And the third part was the most ambitious, I take it.
That was the big one. Aggressively going after brand new markets. Europe, Asia, Latin America. They figured they could generate something like $9.4 billion in new business, permanently replacing those threatened American markets.
Were they targeting specific sectors?
Oh, absolutely. Prepared foods was a huge one. It's an $8.6 billion export market for them, and 90% of it had been dependent on the U.S.
90%.
Also, vegetable oils, animal feed, meat products. RBC economists calculated that if Canada really went for it, they could grow their share of the global export pie by 30% in a decade. That's an extra $44 billion.
So the U.S. threat didn't cripple them. It basically just gave them the political cover they needed to execute a strategy that had probably been on the shelf for years.
That's exactly what happened.
Okay, so where did they start signing these deals? Let's talk about Europe first. They had that CETA agreement already, right? The trade deal with the EU.
They did, but trade had been, pretty modest. The sudden need for stability was the jolt that really activated that agreement to its full potential. CETA is a powerhouse. It had already wiped out tariffs on 98% of Canadian goods.
So they just had to start using it.
And they did, aggressively. We saw Quebec dairy farmers, for instance, report a 34% jump in sales to Europe. Major European grocery chains started public committing to featuring Canadian products.
And the timing was just perfect, wasn't it? Given everything else going on in the world.
Geopolitical perfection. Russia's invasion of Ukraine had thrown Europe's entire east-west trade pipeline into chaos.
For things like potash, wheat.
Potash, wheat, corn, vegetable oil, you name it. Europe was forced to look for new, reliable, politically stable suppliers.
And Canada's stability suddenly became its biggest selling point.
It was their definitive competitive advantage. Europe didn't want a supplier whose trade policy could change with a tweet. Canada became the stable anchor they desperately needed. And critically, they signed multi-year supply contracts.
So this pivot was cemented. It became structural before the U.S. even knew what was happening.
Right. But Europe was only part of the story. Asia was the real game changer.
A gold mine, you called it. Why?
Just the scale. We're talking about Southeast and South Asia, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines. These are the economies that are expected to account for over 31% of global food consumption growth. That's where the future is.
And Canada had a tool for that too, the CPTPP trade agreement.
They did. That gave them preferential access to huge economies like Japan, Australia, Vietnam, a bloc of 500 million consumers.
So again, the U.S. threats just pushed them to use the tool they already had.
Exactly. And the results were dramatic. Huge increases in Canadian wheat to Indonesia, peas and lentils to India, canola pouring into Asian markets that had been dominated by American suppliers.
And this all comes back to one key thing, doesn't it?
Reliability. These weren't just one-time emergency deals. They were long-term partnerships built on Canada's reputation as a stable partner, a reputation the U.S. had basically just forfeited.
So while Canada's out there signing billions in new secure deals, American farmers are watching their second-largest market just disappear.
Systematically dismantle and rebuild its supply chains without them. Canada is a $28 billion a year market for U.S. agriculture. But exports were down 10% in just the first 7 months, and that decline was getting faster.
And the cruelest irony was for the very group the U.S. claimed to be protecting, the dairy farmers.
Oh, it backfired completely. Canadian buyers just pivoted to European suppliers. They stopped buying American dairy altogether.
And it wasn't just dairy, was it?
Not at all. Canadian buyers of U.S. beef, they wanted stability, so they switched to Australian, Brazilian, and Argentine suppliers. And once you build those new supply chains, you don't just switch back. Those customers are gone for good.
A permanent shift.
We saw the same thing with lumber. The U.S. threatened tariffs, and Canadian lumber companies just went and signed long-term deals with construction giants in China, Japan, and South Korea. They moved that demand permanently away from North America.
This is where the strategy becomes truly self-defeating, though. It wasn't just about lost sales. It was about input costs for American farmers.
Yes. Canada is the largest supplier of potash, a key fertilizer to the U.S.
So when the U.S. threatened 25% tariffs on Canadian potash?
They were threatened to dramatically increase the operating costs for the very farmers they were supposedly protecting.
Right in the middle of planting season.
I mean, it's hard to imagine a more counterproductive move.
It's like trying to punish your neighbor by setting your own lawnmower on fire.
Precisely. The Secretary of Agriculture had to step in and literally beg the White House to reduce the proposed tariff from 25% down to 10% because it was about to cripple U.S. farmers.
So they were getting hit from every direction. Lost markets in Canada, retaliatory tariffs from Canada and China.
Exactly. It crushed their cash crop revenues, which fell for a third straight year.
If we pull back, the fundamental error was treating food like it's just another commodity, wasn't it?
It was. Food is about security, it's about resilience. Weaponizing it forced Canada to prioritize stability and reliability over everything else, over price, over convenience.
And that psychological shift in Canada became permanent. You had Buy Canadian campaigns everywhere.
And the public was behind it. Polls showed 68% of Canadians were consciously avoiding U.S. products. Among people under 40, it was 79%.
Wow.
That political will drove domestic production to expand to meet that new demand.
And the global message was loud and clear.
Very clear. The U.S. was unpredictable. Canadian exporters used that. They basically went to international buyers and said, "We won't threaten you with tariffs because our president is having a bad day. We're a stable partner." That promise was worth billions.
And that's why this damage is structural. The Canadian food processor who switched from American to Brazilian corn, they invested in new logistics, new relationships. They're not switching back if U.S. corn gets a little cheaper.
The investment is made. And look at the grocery stores. They built whole marketing campaigns around supporting local Canadian farms. They can't just abandon that. Canada is on track now to double its non-U.S. food exports within a decade.
We have to pause here and think about the human cost. These aren't just abstract numbers.
No, they're families. They are people whose livelihoods were destroyed by decisions they had no voice in, often by leaders they actually supported. Dairy farmers in Wisconsin saw their income drop 40%.
40%.
Corn farmers in Iowa watched prices collapse. Ranchers in Montana lost Canadian customers they had had for decades to Australian beef.
So if we boil this all down, the U.S. thought it was demonstrating its overwhelming strengths, its agricultural power.
But what it was actually doing was teaching the world, starting with its closest neighbor, how to survive and even thrive without American agriculture.
It exposed its own weakness while trying to wield power.
Exactly. It showed how dependent the U.S. was on that stable Canadian demand in some really critical sectors.
Which teaches us a huge lesson that once food security becomes the priority, market access, which is all about trust, can be lost permanently.
And that brings up a final thought for you, our listener, to really think about. That empty warehouse in Iowa, the one waiting for Canadian orders that are never going to come again, that is the real structural legacy of this trade war.
What happens to a global superpower when its hard-earned reputation for long-term reliability is just destroyed in less than 2 years? That is the real cost of weaponizing food. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.